Welcome to the Manuscript Academy podcast,
brought to you by
a writer
and an agent
who both believe that education is key.
The beauty is the people you meet along the way,
and that community makes all the difference.
Here at the Manuscript Academy, you can learn the skills, make the connections, and have access to experts, all from home.
I'm Julie Kingsley.
And I'm Jessica Sinsheimer.
Put down your pens, pause your word counts, and enjoy.
Yes, Emmy, please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Emmy. I actually will let you in on a little secret, which is that I soft opened to queries today for the first time in maybe a year. I'm just starting my 5th year as an agent, which is wild to think about. So, I don't know that my tastes have changed that much over the last 5 years. I'm always looking, like any agent, I think I'm always looking for something new and surprising. I love the weird queries that make me look twice. The weirder something is, I can almost guarantee you it will intrigue me. That's like catnip for me, but I do represent across age categories and genres. I love thrillers. For a long time, my tagline was murder is my comfort read, which is still very true. I love formulaic murder mystery type style. And I think the thing that I often tell people about, just because I do represent so broadly, is that our agency is very well known for sort of our history in literary fiction. So although that's not the majority of what I represent, I tend to do more kind of book club upmarket style writing. But as an agency, the thing that kind of ties us all together is that we really, really appreciate sort of line level writing. So that's, if you feel like you have kind of a poet in your ear while you're writing, that's sort of usually where my sweet spot is really, really sharp, smart, lush writing. So yeah, the one thing that I'm not doing is diving into the romantasy pool. As much as I have read a lot of romantasy in my life, I don't feel like I am expert level on that path like some people are. So I am staying out of it. But other than that, I'm pretty open. So yeah.
Oh, I imagine you get lots of good things.
Yeah. I spent last year really focusing on the clients I already had and not kind of looking at a lot of new things. And so I'm really excited this year to have the space to be able to open up some spots on my list and see what's new. And yeah, I'm excited.
Yay. Well, I hope you get some wonderful things. And I'm so happy to have the world premiere of Emmy's opening to queries on our podcast.
It's an exciting time. What can I say?
Right?
Like a scoop.
A fresh inbox.
Yeah. So we had asked you to speak about agent red and green flags. And I think you are the perfect person to talk with about this because you always approach things in this really nuanced way. And we had some really nuanced questions from a writer who was writing to us. And I was thinking, wait a second, this is a podcast topic. And
awesome.
And I think there's so much overlap here between finding the agent who's going to be a good fit for you and a good business partner, and also hopefully someone you like talking with, and also the overlap of just deciding what kind of people should be in your life in general.
Yeah, totally. I think that, the thing I always tell people when they're querying me is that my biggest priority for me and for authors is always finding the right fit. And it's not easy to do. It's really, really challenging. And I've definitely, I've had some relationships with clients where right away it's been clear once we've started working together, oh, this is not actually how we both wanted this to go. And, in some cases we have parted ways. In some cases we've adjusted and it's, we've moved on to have a great relationship. But it's definitely easier when you can find the person that you click with, especially, if that is able to build over time, because sometimes obviously people's goals grow and change and you're not always going to be the same writer that you are now. But I think that finding people who you feel like you can trust and talk to and have a good relationship with is probably more even important than their sales skills and things like that in terms of having, maintaining good mental health in this very challenging industry. I love the idea of doing both green and red and there's also things in the middle that are totally neutral. I mean, as subjective as it is, I think that sometimes people, and I think all people, because we're also used to getting rejections, right? You are really afraid when you're writing a query or when you're submitting something sometimes that there will be things that are red flag, red flag, red flag, but then you don't always think about the things that balance those, that make people extra happy to see what's in their inbox. So I really like that idea.
I like that too. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's like that. You see that in live conferences sometimes where
Mhm.
like raise your hand when you'll stop reading. And then the
that's
first,
a rough
so
one.
hard.
like there's 4 words and people are like, their hands are all raised. And you're like, that was 4 words.
Yeah, that's a little soon, even for me.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a idea that if you are just critical enough of the wrong query or the wrong agent who is offering you
Right.
representation, then you will always be 100% safe. And there is no such thing.
No, it's all so subjective. And I find it interesting. Sometimes I get things back from editors, even like reminding me, like, this is just one person's opinion, or just because it doesn't fit on our list doesn't mean I didn't like it. Like, you're on the right track. And I feel like sometimes it does feel like, there's so much rejection around us all the time that, like, it feels like there must be like a right way, but there is not a right way, just like there's not a totally wrong way. So yeah, it's hard to nail sometimes for sure.
I would argue there are a few totally wrong ways, but
Well, there's always going to be outliers, but I think it's difficult if you're somebody, especially like in this context. I feel like a lot of the people who I talk to through Manuscript Academy, even if they're like early in the process, they are being mindful about it and they're researching and they're learning. And I think once you've hit that point, generally speaking, I don't think I've ever seen a query that I've read that I've been like, oh God, this is like an absolute no. Like, everything about this is wrong. So I think that, like, as long as you're approaching it from that place of like improving and wanting to do the best you can, I think that that's a good place to start from at the very least.
Well, I was thinking about this when we had our 3-day submission class, and it's always is great. It's always busy. We have really smart people.
Yeah.
And afterwards, a couple of people reached out to us and they said, the odds are still really hard. The odds are really hard. But I was wondering this. We keep seeing really good work come from the Manuscript Academy, really good work. And so when you look at the odds of getting published, right? It seems like it's really hard, but then what percentage of query letters just from the get-go, I mean, like, is it like 50% haven't done any research? Is it 20% haven't done any? Do you guys have any
like in
sense
terms of the
that?
slush pile?
Yeah, I mean, it's because it's like there's so many people that just like quickly write a book. It's not under industry standards. They haven't. It's just random who they've queried.
Yeah.
They haven't done their research. But everyone has like that idea. Everyone has a book in them. Like if you go to a party, everyone's like, "Well, I have a really good story." Like you hear that all the time. And like, how many of those people are kind of clogging up? Is it like cholesterol? Is it like clogging up the lines,
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure every agent has a different answer to this because all of our slush piles are going to look different, but definitely like the way our slush pile at Westwood works is that everything comes in centrally, right? So if it's your turn to go through the slush pile, you're looking at everybody's. And so, yeah, like we get a huge amount of unsolicited, like I would say generally speaking, like at least 30 to 40 queries a week per agent. So like, I mean, every day when you go in there's like a couple hundred at least, right? So man, probably, yeah, I think 50% might be conservative, to be honest, because there are a lot of people, and not to say that all of those are even bad, but just to your point about like having done research and having like thought through the process in terms of people who just like randomly send off, well, maybe I'll publish this. Yeah, I think 50 is probably low. Like, and some of those are great books, and some of them even are like experienced authors who are great writers who just like have no idea what querying is about. And so you get these like kind of cover letter-esque emails, that are like, they're not what you would expect from a query, but it's somebody being like, I've published here and here, and I have this book idea. Like, it's not all stuff that's like, I would just like get rid of it, but it is stuff that people are like, clearly they don't know what the process expectations are at all, for better or worse.
So a couple of years ago, well, at this point, gosh, more than a decade ago. So years ago, I was invited to be on a panel, and I was unclear on the concept of a panel. So I thought the reasonable thing to do would be to get 3 months of data and make a pie chart.
I mean, I love that for you. I would have been excited about that.
I mean, it's kind of nerdy, but I love it.
So I show up with this rolled up poster board, and I'd done the thing. I was like remembering math class, how you make like the correct angles for the percentages. And it was in the high 60s of queries that had no research whatsoever. Either I was completely wrong in terms of the genre for it, or the format was completely wrong, or they didn't know how agents worked, or they said, "Dear editor," Or so it's a very, very high percentage of what we get is people who are not doing basic research. Now, obviously, not everyone has time away from work and family obligations and other obligations to put in the time to do that research. So I think it's only fair that we acknowledge that, yes, it is a steep learning curve. It is a complicated industry. It is needlessly opaque, needlessly complicated. It takes years to learn everything that you need to know. But yeah, to know enough to get a query to a researched place, that's going to be a couple weeks at least of a few hours a week figuring it out. And so not everyone's going to do that for whatever reason.
I think it's great news for people out there.
It is reassuring on some level, right? To know that if you're starting from a more educated place, you're already like within the top 40% of what's landing in people's inboxes. Yeah.
Yeah. On the other hand, it's like if you've got 3 minimum wage jobs and 3 kids, you're probably looking at that number and you're like, how am I going to do that?
Yeah, it's true. I do think there is also like a certain percentage of people who just don't even realize that it's competitive, you know what I mean? Or that they should be doing research. So there's always, I feel like we do get some of those queries that are like people who, even some, I'm sure I've sent rejections sometimes being like, just go out and Google this process. I don't know that you know how this works or like that you've looked into it. And maybe your book is great, but you need to like kind of start from a different point than you've started from.
Do you remember that site? Let me just Google that for you.
Yes, exactly.
So, when you start in publishing, you're often an assistant, and I was functionally a receptionist for a number of years. And so I'd answer the phone. And I remember this one time this woman was asking all of these really basic things, and I was happy to help her for like 10 minutes before I knew I was clogging up the line and I'd get in trouble in case, what if a client came through with something urgent, or what if someone called to tell my boss that the lunch meeting was off and I missed it, and then she gets all the way to the restaurant, things like that. So at that point, I was just like, okay, so like the good news is a lot of this is online. You can just type it into Google and you'll get the answers you need. And suddenly she's like, well, thanks a lot, and hung up the phone.
Wow. That's harsh.
So like that's out there too. There's a lot of thanks a lot B word energy out there too.
100%.
I was thinking of this the other day. Jessica, do you remember when you were in Maine and we had, what was it, like Bon Appetit said the best tuna fish sandwich in the country at the Palace Diner?
Oh,
right?
Yeah.
Right. And it was such a simple thing. It was like tuna fish, right? And but it was the best.
It was good.
Yeah. Tuna fish, and it is really good, right?
And it's in a train car. That was my
it's in a train car. So it's an experience
cool.
and everything else. But yeah, so I think like queries are so confined, like a tuna fish sandwich, just elevated. Like the mayo is lighter. There's a perfect crunch. There's the perfect spice. There's a lot of iceberg lettuce. There was like homemade. It was delicious. But but it's like basically just like a tuna fish sandwich. It's not, but it is. It's like, okay, you have 3 or 4 paragraphs. Each one has a specific, tool that or is it a tool, or you use tools within each paragraph to do something to communicate your work. And, with that, it has to be kind of just enough. And so, Emmy, the age-old question. We get some flack sometimes when we say 350 words or less. We get pushback all the time. What are your thoughts on that? Do you allow more for fantasy, or do you like it as clean and as precise as it could be?
Yeah, I'm like a clean and precise person. And I also get some pushback from authors on that sometimes, even when I'm consulting on queries and things like that. I always tell people 3 paragraphs. The whole point for me is to like get you to the writing sample, right? The goal is to intrigue people enough about your idea that they're like, okay, this is worth investigating. And so to me, like, you don't actually want to spend that much time in the letter if you can. We're all so busy. We all have so much reading to do. This is like the perennial feeling in publishing all the time. And I would rather be reading your writing than reading your letter,
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's great if people have a perfectly crafted letter. I'm not going to say that's not satisfying, but at the same time, if I'm reading your letter, if I have 10 minutes to look in my inbox and I'm like heading out to lunch or something, like I want to spend those 10 minutes reading something cool, not reading a query letter, So in a perfect world, like it's a quick read and then you get to the good stuff. So absolute maximum, like you want maybe 450, but I think 350 is a good benchmark to aim for. Like even 300, it's great if you can get each of those paragraphs to like 100 words ish, that's the magic for me, because then you get all the information you need like quick and easy. You're not like digging around for something that's ultimately like kind of boring because you want to get to the actual written part.
I like that. I like that you say that we can either spend the time on your query or your pages, and wouldn't you rather we are reading your actual book?
Yeah, I mean, in a perfect world, I'd have time for all of it. That would be great. But I think a lot of us, like, I know that queries for me have to come after my client work because we're always prioritizing what's time sensitive for the people we're already engaged to work with. So to me, if I have that time at the end of my day, I don't want to spend it necessarily reading about comps and numbers of words. I'd rather be like diving into something that I'm loving.
Mm.
I've started
Yeah.
thinking about the concept of a frictionless query and a frictionless first chapter.
Oh, I love that.
And
Yeah.
that you
Mm.
don't want us to have a moment where we're like, wait, what's that? Maybe I'll go Google it. And then we don't come
Hmm.
back. Or wait, how does that work? I guess I have to read it again. You don't want that. Or
Yeah.
wait, how does that go with that? I don't like that. I don't understand. I'll move on.
Hmm.
Or just the general, if I was going to take a pop quiz on this, I would fail. Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
All
For
of those
sure.
are things that can knock someone out of your query completely needlessly, and they're usually fixable. And
Yeah.
going back to the tuna fish sandwich, I've been thinking about it in terms of cake. So we've got cake, which you absolutely need. You've got icing, which is nice.
We're
You've
very
got
food
sprinkles.
orientated.
I'm
It's
here for
before
it.
lunch. This is going to happen. And then you've got sprinkles, which you don't need at all, but they're nice. And
Yeah.
then I guess you've also got like the little animated characters on top. Very divisive. Are you going to set it on fire? Are you going to use fireworks? Are they going to be the candles that don't blow out? All of that is up to you. But I think
Yeah.
most writers focus too much on the sprinkles and not enough on the cake.
Yeah.
Mm.
And I feel like a lot of
Mhm.
people get really caught up too on like, if it's not in the query, I don't think I'm going to find it in the book, which is not true. One thing I always tell people, like in editing in general, is like cutting out words that you don't really need, right? That's always like a basic to me. But like, in a query letter, so often people need to include, like, feel the need to include the character's first name, last name, occupation, age, like all these things. And I'm like, I assume if I read a 300-page book, I'm going to get that information eventually, but do I need it before I even start the book? Is it that
Yeah.
the fact that the character is 27 instead of 38, is that essential to your plot line? No, cut out those three words, move on. Like, and in some
Yeah.
cases it is, if you're writing whatever, a YA, sometimes it's nice to know whether somebody's in their last year of high school versus their first
Right.
year or whatever. Sometimes it makes sense, but in a lot of cases I'm like, I don't need to know like all of these details, every character, every plot point, where the person lives. Like, give me the essentials to like hook me in, but like beyond that, we know there's a book coming.
I think there's also a lot of moral perfectionism. And
100%.
people are worried
Well,
that
can
the
you
agent.
define that? Define that for everyone.
Oh, that's tough. I think of it in terms of people thinking of every little tiny detail having to absolutely 100% line up between their query and the pages, and feeling as though if they possibly give a false impression, or it seems like something
Mm,
happens faster or slower, or if they don't tell us everything that we need and we might be surprised, it's almost as if they're worried that we will think that they're lying, when really I'm not going to be that detail oriented. I'm going to be, do I like the vibe of this? Do I like the writing cool onto the pages?
yeah.
Mm.
I feel like people feel that way too about writing multiple versions of a query letter sometimes. I have definitely told people, especially when people have books that are like sort of within a couple of different genres, maybe. And I think that when they're querying agents, they might want to like frame it in terms of one thing or another. So, like, for example, I don't do a lot of like really hard sci-fi, but I do work on books that are speculative. That said, like, some people will want to work with an agent who their only thing that they do is sci-fi. They're like very niche and specialized. So if you're querying me versus querying someone who has that kind of an approach, probably you're going to want to frame the letter a little bit differently, because I don't necessarily work just within that genre. Somebody who does work in a very specific niche, you're going to want to situate your book within what it is that they do, right? People seem to think that that's dishonest in some way. And I'm like, no, like books are so subjective. Like there's so many different ways you can frame and pitch a book for a different reader, for a different audience, for a different agent. And just because you have that level of versatility, it doesn't mean that you're lying to anybody. It just means that you know that your book can land in a number of different ways. And I think that that's totally fair.
Yeah, there's no 23andMe for your books genre. It's not going to be like you are 23% book club. You are 45%
That is
horror.
amazing.
It
Everyone
doesn't
make one
exist.
right now. Send it to us. It's a 23 and me about your book.
It doesn't exist. And I think that it's smart, as Emmy says, to, if you have a book that could be 3 or 4 different genres,
Yeah.
look and see what that agent does the most and call it that. I don't think that's lying. I think that is bringing to the forefront the elements that are already there.
Well, and I think like, yeah,
possibilities, right? I think we were about to say the same thing.
Yeah, I agree. And even as an agent, looking at it that way in terms of submissions, I've sent, you send a little email usually along with your submission. I usually write a personal note if I know the editor well, you know what I mean? I think it's the same thing if you're querying. You want that person to know that you know what they're looking for. And because that's different for everyone, that, query letters are going to vary a little bit from person to person. I'm not going to get super mad if like I reach out to a colleague and I'm like, look at this cool query I got, and they got something slightly different for the same book. I'm not going to be like, oh, they're trying to pull a fast one on us,
No, absolutely not. That is smart. And also, like, even if you call it, in my opinion, the wrong genre, that is a find replace once for me. That is an easy fix.
Exactly. Although I will say, in terms of things that are like very green flags, I love clever comps. Like when I read a comp selection that clearly shows me that people are, especially if it like demonstrates that they're really well read in their genre, or at least really well researched. I guess I can't know if they've actually read the books that they're, comping to or whatever, but I like it when comps are like very precise, like very specific, because I'm like, oh, you know exactly like what you're trying to do here. And maybe the book doesn't quite get there, but the fact that like people are thinking that much about it, I find like super exciting to me as like someone who I'd really like to work with. That's always a good indicator.
I also think it's interesting because I met with one writer today who I'd met with a couple months ago looking at a new version. And I had completely forgotten that I had just, for reasons that I don't understand, thought of this one particular niche book for her. And I said it to her this time and she's like, oh yeah, you mentioned it last time. And it's almost as if books can have conversations with each other 100%. And you don't know why until you read them. And I'm really hoping she gets it and tells me why my brain went there.
It's kind of like, it's like the trees talk to each other, like in the forest, the trees have a whole root system underneath it. Yeah. And I think that the librarians and the booksellers and the kids and the readers are the book clubs are the root systems. And that's what's so interesting about, like, I know you liked this, so how about this? Or when you have a good relationship with your librarian or the people at the bookstore, and they just kind of know, they walk in, we have a new one, go check it out, and that is what a comp is. Like there is like real comps, but there's also like just the world infrastructure.
Super 100%. It used to be way easier for me to do comps when I was working as a bookseller than it is now. It takes so much more work now because I used to spend all day thinking that way, right? And it is totally like making those associations between like, like, oh, if you like this author and, there isn't something new by them, okay, who else? Like those little, and it is really hard to articulate sometimes. I think that a lot of people think plot when they think comps, and that's not necessarily where my brain goes at all. Usually it's tone or writing style, something like that. And if people get like weird and creative with it, sometimes I like that too. If they could picture, one of the characters in their books like kind of coming from the same family as a character in another book or something like that, I'm like, oh, that's a neat way to think about that.
Yeah. It's also going back to the idea of the trees and their roots. I've heard that our brain structure is a little similar to tree roots as well. And it's funny how much we store in there and forget about. Have you ever had a song come on the radio and it's 20 years old and somehow all the lyrics are still in your brain? And I think that happens with comps too. I, the other day, thought of the Stephanie Plum books and I hadn't thought about those in like years. And, it suggested those to an author. I hope she reads those and hope she tells me why my brain went there too. But I think it's one of those things where it's easier to do by human, librarian versus going on Amazon and typing in keywords, though certainly worth a try. But those out there who are really stuck with your comps, you could head over to our Facebook group and ask our smart writers about, here's my query. Can you think of any comps or can you think of any books like this? So yeah, manuscriptacademy.com/Facebook for our free Facebook group there.
That's awesome. Yeah, because I always tell people like the best way is if you have a really good relationship with a librarian or a bookseller, they're always going to think about things that won't come into your mind. It happens for me all the time, but I not everybody has that in their area either. So sometimes being able to pick other people's brains is the best way.
And also, you know how they talk about, and I don't think this is true, though I imagine it's gotten flight attendants lots of free coffees. You know how they talk about going in and you're like, hi, thanks so much for being here. Here are 4 lattes for everybody. And people think it'll get them upgraded to like first class. I doubt it.
Yes.
But sure, I'm not opposed to people giving out free coffees. Safety concerns for the flight attendants aside.
I know,
But,
I was going to say.
actually, that's really dangerous now that I think of it. If all the flight attendants
I
get
know we're I think that's a plot. I think you just created a plot.
that is an awful
Spike. Homeland Security comes knocking.
Red flag, red flag.
Dear. Someone a sealed coffee. Anyway, I imagine there's a technique for befriending one's local librarian in that vein too, that hopefully also won't
100%.
bring down a plane.
People used to bring us treats at the bookstore where I used to work, and we always really appreciated it. That I will say.
When my kids were in high school, the term was "What's good." You know, instead of like how you doing, like what's good, and I was like, that's the perfect going into the bookstore, like what's good, tell me,
It's true.
you know.
Oh yeah.
And it's such a great conversation. Well, I read that one, but I didn't, you know, like, and sometimes like a really popular book I won't love for whatever
Totally.
reason, you know. And there's a kind of famous one right now, and it's just I don't know why it carves into me. And I told the bookseller that, and she was like, same. And we just had this moment in the corner of the bookstore, you know, like we're all different, you know, so they're gonna try to suss you out. Once they do,
Totally.
you know, you can have the most amazing conversations about books. And that's really where the magic in the book world is.
I always find it interesting too to ask, especially if you have a really good little bookstore, like one that's well curated, or even like a Barnes and Noble where you know that like people they're really busy, like that sort of thing. If you go in and just ask them like what other people are buying, because there's a huge difference between like what, especially in bookstores like big chain stores where they have sometimes like contractual incentives to put things out front and things too. Like sometimes there's a huge difference between what's on the front table and what they actually see moving out the door with customers, you know. Like sometimes when I was at the bookstore on new release day, we'd unpack something and it would be gone in the first day. And I'd be like, what is this? It's just those unexpected gems. But I think that booksellers are great for knowing like those things that people are picking up on, maybe more than the media is, or more than the sales reports might tell from the initial couple of weeks.
Yeah.
So curious and interesting, right? How content moves and people change and like with whatever's happening in the world. And it's so precariously delightful, you know?
Yeah.
Comps are also interesting that way in terms of thinking of it in terms of red and green flags. Like when people pick comps that are just super, super popular, like that for me, it's not a red flag, but I would say it's something that like makes me wonder how the person is thinking about their own kind of writing journey. Because obviously, if you're a writer, I would think that you would have read things other than those books. You know what I mean? Things that would have inspired you in different ways. And so when I see like, you know, Gillian Flynn and Dan Brown or whatever, I'm like, oh, it's such a like surface level answer that it makes me wonder like why you would give it if you like are really trying to sell your book. Sometimes, I mean, obviously it might just be an experience. It might be people being like, oh, these sold really well. And I also wrote a thriller or whatever. It's a very simple way to answer the question, but sometimes it sort of belies people who are trying to do less, trying to like sell their book more than write it, I guess. I don't know how to say that well, but you know, they're thinking more about the sales aspect or the commercial aspect than they are about their own craft or their own trajectory. And I always want a little bit more than that.
Yeah, I was reading recently about somebody who interviewed people extremely well, had an incredibly high success rate of hiring exactly the right people for the job.
That's awesome.
And he said that the way that he did it was that he asked people what they liked about it and listened for a very specific answer. Because when people are really good at something, they're really good at one specific part of it.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
So I think that level of specificity is generally confidence inspiring. People talk a lot about red flags, and we'll get to those in a moment. But what are some green flags? Say an author gets an offer. What are they looking for that should just make them be like, yes, this could absolutely be the person I spend my career with?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, so I would say that for most of these questions, there's going to be like kind of a hard answer and a soft answer, because there's always going to be like things that are industry business kind of standards that unfortunately like are not very well articulated across the industry. I think it's very hard to find good information on what you can expect. And then there's also just the personality stuff, which is going to vary obviously from person to person. For this one, on the hard side, like having a good look at the agreement that you're offered on paper, having a couple people read it over. If you know someone who has a good eye for legal stuff, it doesn't have to be like a formal lawyer review in my experience, but just somebody who can sort of tell you what sorts of things to look out for. So, just the basic, there shouldn't be any fee for service, that kind of thing, aside from the commissions, but initial in terms of payment, you shouldn't be paying an agency anything unless they've already sold your book or had it acquired, unless there's a really good reason for it. If it's shipping for something, then maybe, but in general, there shouldn't be a fee for service. Generally speaking, like our agency agreement at Westwood is like a page. It's pretty simple, maybe 2 pages, but there's not a lot to it. It's fairly basic. And I think that that's pretty standard within the industry, is to have enough detail in your agency agreement to know what you're really getting into without having a whole bunch of restrictions on what you're able to do. So I would say, yeah, make sure you give it a read over. If you have another author friend who can take a look at it, and ask lots and lots of questions. And I would say that that's a green flag, is somebody who invites you to ask all those questions and to discuss the details with you, because your agency agreement is like the most basic agreement you're going to get from the publishing industry. Ideally, from that point forward, you're looking at like much more detailed contracts and making much more nuanced decisions. So I think somebody who's able to like really explain the terms and conditions of your agreement to you in like not only like a factual way, but also like a practical, what does this really mean in terms of how we work together, all of that kind of thing. And then, of course, you definitely want to follow your gut in terms of people's personalities, I would say. If you're having a hard time approaching your agent or getting a hold of them, sometimes, we have to be reasonable about these things. People are super, super busy. So sometimes it does take some time. But I think that you can generally get a sense for what you're comfortable with in terms of level of communication, style of communication. And you should never feel super, in my experience, super intimidated or super negative about interactions that you have with an agent early on. That doesn't bode well for the future of working together. You really want to feel like you're on, as much as possible, kind of an equal footing. You know what I mean? For a professional business relationship, it's obviously not going to feel like you're besties right up front, but I think you should at least feel comfortable talking to someone about, the details, because there are going to be lots of details to come, ideally. And especially like editorial conversations, financial conversations, like those are difficult to have with someone who you don't feel like you can approach or discuss things with. So, yeah.
Yeah, I really like the idea of watching how they respond to the questions you ask about the agreement. Because you don't want someone who's, "Oh, you don't understand that. How are we going to work together?
Exactly.
Oh my gosh, it's just basic. Just read it." No, you don't want that. You want someone who's really good at explaining what all of this means and the likely practical applications for how this could play out. So you can say, does this mean that if I do X, will Y happen? You can do that, but try to get it translated into practical terms that you can easily understand.
Totally. The other thing I would say is like communication style. I'm really upfront with everyone that, like, generally speaking, I do most of my work by email. I'm most comfortable, especially when it comes to things like contracts and things like that. I find it easier to give people accurate information if I write it down first. So if people like, their number one go-to for communication is let's hop on a phone call, I'm probably not the right agent for them. I get anxious about the phone. I like to like schedule calls a little bit in advance, that kind of thing. And that doesn't mean, I never hop on the phone. Obviously, I do it as much as, my clients need. But in terms of a first step, I usually like to try email first. And so I find that being mindful of that, if you're the type of person and you know about yourself that you like to be able to like pick up a phone and call someone whenever, when it's convenient, or you like to text message, or you like to email, knowing that you're going to have to work with that style for your whole relationship together. It's good to have those expectations up front too. So, if you're emailing someone and getting no response, but they always answer your phone calls, that's one way of communicating, right? So you want to make sure that you're comfortable with that, or vice versa. If somebody texts you all the time, but you hate text messages, like, you want to have that conversation early on, because there's lots of different ways to approach working through these things.
Can I play devil's advocate?
Yeah, please.
So this, we're looking at, writers looking at agents, but what are some like red flags or green flags when we turn it around, when,
Yeah.
like when you're looking at a writer that you're thinking of representing?
Yeah. I mean, so there are so many, obviously. I think so. One thing I always tell authors to be prepared for is that an agent is going to Google you. I think for any job at this point, people should probably know that. But in terms of a business relationship, it would be sort of silly not to, right? So sometimes I don't Google people if they're like referred to me by somebody else, if I feel like I can trust that person, but usually I do. Sometimes it's to like see if, they have bylines that they didn't tell me about. Sometimes it's to see like how active they are on social media, that kind of thing. But people are always going to. So I would just be mindful of your online presence and what you're posting about yourself always. Publishing is a very forward facing industry. You're at some point probably going to be expected to have interactions with authors or with readers on some level if you're an author. So whether that's social media or not, or whatever else you're involved in your life, make sure that you feel like you're being portrayed accurately or you're portraying yourself accurately. But for me, like I think the most challenging thing I have in terms of the query process is if I feel like I'm being leveraged. That's something that I've become a little bit sensitive about over the years. And I think a lot of people are and a lot of agents are, but we don't really talk about it very much. But it's that sort of thing where, if you feel like an author is working with you through the query process only to get opportunities from other agents, like I am 100% for pursuing all of your opportunities. Like definitely take as many calls as you want to take. Like I said, like for me, fit is huge. So like I always encourage people, talk to everybody. Like if you're getting lots of opportunities, like definitely feel them all out. But if you've gotten 5 offers to have a call from an agent and you know that you're not going to take my offer, you already know, like I would rather work with one of these 4 other agents, then be respectful of people's time too, because it's really challenging to make that kind of time and emotional investment in a relationship and then have someone turn around and say kind of for no reason, oh, by the way, this other agent, I'm going to go with them. And it's awesome if, to me, I'm like, I always wish people congratulations. I always wish people all the best. Sometimes you have a call with someone and they just aren't the right person, but sometimes you line up 4 or 5 calls and you already know that you're going to take one of those offers, or you've already had a formal offer that you've said yes to and you're just taking it to kind of be polite. You don't need to do that. You know what I mean? Make sure that you're like
Yeah.
really following kind of your gut and your heart on that one as much as possible.
And if that happens, I think it's completely fine to just
Yeah.
say, I had a conversation with an agent.
Oh,
We really
100%.
connected. I'm going to say yes to them versus I liked everyone better than you.
Exactly, for sure. I actually had a conversation with an author this week that I thought like they handled things super well. We had been talking for like a while. They were recommended to me like quite a while back, but I was quite backed up on queries at that point. And so I had kind of put them off for a bit and we had talked a little bit, but I really fell in love with their writing. I finally set up a call with them. They also, in the meantime, got 2 offers of representation. And they sort of said to me, I'm really sorry. It's been really great getting to know you, but I'm looking for an agent who lives closer to me. And I don't think it would be fair to either of us to take this call, even though, we already set it up. Like that to me is so respectful to be like, okay, if you already know that this isn't going to be the right thing, yeah, don't waste your own time. And also don't maybe put the agent through that of having to answer all these questions and kind of be on the hot seat and then turn around and be like, oh, actually, I never was going to say yes to this. That's challenging for me. But I like to hope that you can sort of tell when people's intentions are good and they're exploring their options. I try to be as transparent with people as possible when they're going through the process too. So if I think I'm going to make them an offer, I will be really clear about that. If I want to talk to them more and I want to kind of see what kind of editorial they would be comfortable with, that kind of thing, I'm open about that too. I'm not 100% sure about this book, but I'd like to know more about you. I'd like to know more about the book, that kind of thing. And I hope that authors can be that way as well. I am querying multiple agents. Cool, that's totally fine. But I'm querying my dream agent. They've already made me an offer. And, I'm still kind of using the fact that I have other agents interested to get their attention. That's less fine.
Yeah. Yeah. And
Yeah.
that's something that authors might not know other authors are doing. I
Yeah.
was thinking this morning about the advice to set a boundary and see how people react.
Oh, that's a great suggestion. Yeah.
But I also don't think authors should manufacture a problem just to see
Mm-mm.
how people react. So, what I was thinking might be the ideal situation if it happened organically would be if the agent suggests an editorial change that you're not sure about. If you
Mhm.
either say, could we do it another way? Would you be open to alternate methods of doing this if it comes to the same conclusion, or if you just have another idea in mind, if you pitch it and see how they react. And I think the biggest green flag here would be if they say, oh, yes, and we could do this. Or you want someone who's flexible and not a, you will do it the way that I say because it's my book now kind of reaction.
100%. Yeah. I think discussing editorial style is a really good idea when you're looking at picking an agent or when you're an agent looking at which authors to work with. Earlier, when we were saying there's no right or wrong answer to a lot of these questions, editorial style is one of those things. People work really well together or people have really different styles and you have to learn to compromise, right? And I've worked with both. I've had people who, like I send out my editorial and I get like happy rainbow smiles back. And I've definitely also had people who, like really struggle with it. So it's good to kind of explain to people like what your process is like. And I think it is a good thing to have a conversation, especially since you're pitching a book anyway, you know what I mean? To sort of think about what kinds of changes would the agent want to see in that project and how flexible are they and what's their rationale too? Like, is it just taste or is it for some other reason like marketing or, like trends in the publishing industry, like those sorts of things?
Well, I think it comes down to honesty. And I think that's if you're having an honest conversation and, if someone's saying this to you as a writer, I think some people will say, they'll say yes to anything because they've been working so hard to get an agent. When you finally have one in the chute, yes, of course, anything you want, right? But in the end, it's not that, right? And so I think going into this process, knowing you want an honest communication, and sometimes we hear that at the Manuscript Academy, like someone wants critique, but they don't really want critique. The whole idea that if you as a writer, you spend all this time in your query, you spend all this time in your writing, but really thinking of your learning styles, what kind of relationship you want. And then I think there is like a manifestation process. I know that's kind of like a hokey word, but if you write down what you want, it's going to help you make the decision as you move through this. And so
For sure.
it might mean you have to say no to somebody because it's just not going to work, but at least it's an honest, I need someone that is like this. And I think it just makes everyone happier. I think in publishing, without the element of honesty, then we're missing a lot of growth opportunities, but also to have the type of career that we all want to have.
Yeah. I will also say, in terms of red flags, green flags, something that I find really interesting is what questions people bring to the agent call. I do want people to have questions. You know what I mean? I want people to be asking for the things that they need and the things that they're curious about or that they don't understand. But there's a big difference between, like I Googled for 3 days straight and I have this enormous list of questions that the whole internet tells me I have to ask every single one of them versus like I have, 4 or 5 like really thought out specific personal questions that are important to me. And I think that to me is like a huge green flag for an author when they have questions that are clearly pertinent to them or that they are actually wondering about. And it can be a big red flag when people have so many questions, To me, I'm happy to answer as many questions as I possibly can, but there's a certain level of trust in the relationship too. So you have to at some point get to the point where you believe in the person you've decided to work with more than what you just see randomly on the internet. And I think that being able to get the information you need versus and balancing that with sort of what's possible to answer to in like a 1 hour phone call can be really helpful. And then on the flip side, I think agents should also be asking you questions. If they have nothing that they want to know from you, except like, how can I sell your books? That's not, to me at least, an ideal scenario. Like, I know that some agents are very sales focused, and if that's what you're looking for, then maybe that's all you need. But at least knowing what they're interested in about you and how you work, I think it can be a red or a green flag. If they're asking you a lot of questions that you're like super uncomfortable with, run for the hills. You know what I mean? If they're absolutely not interested in your goals either or what you're looking for, I think that should be a big red flag. Unless specifically like this agent does only this and this is exactly what I want. But even then, like you should be able to have a conversation to establish that. You know what I mean? So yeah, I think listening to the questions that you're being asked and outside of just giving an answer that's honest, but also in terms of like what those questions lead you to believe about the relationship down the road, that can be a really valuable indicator.
I think a yes and response from an agent is usually a green flag.
Yeah, I agree. And especially when people are able to sort of articulate needs that they have, if you're able to ask if people are able to accommodate you, I think that's great, no matter what the need is. So, do you like a lot of editorial feedback? Awesome. Are you like asking your agent, are you able to provide that level of feedback? What level of capacity do you have to support your clients? Do you work with assistants? Do you not? Those kinds of things. Depending on what you're really looking for, I think that those questions, yeah, the agent should be excited to give you their answers in a lot of ways and should be like looking forward to the possibilities, not so much seeing just like where they have to draw lines and limits, right?
I think it's also sometimes wise to share a little bit of business casual vulnerability and see what
Yeah.
happens. So if you say, I am scared that we will send the book out, and what if nobody takes it? Does that mean I'm fired?
Yeah, for sure. That's a totally reasonable question to ask. What do you do when a book doesn't sell? Because that happens frequently, right? I mean, nobody likes that to be the situation, but I've had clients for whom, the first couple books we've taken out, we haven't gotten any response from. But especially because the perspective of my agency is very much that we're like with a client for their whole career, ideally. So we don't give up on them after their first book. But there are agencies that have different approaches than that, and agents who have different approaches too. And it might also, if you take a book out on submission and it doesn't work, and you can sort of see that it's because of the relationship not working, is it reasonable for you to be able to back out of that relationship and seek other representation? What does that look like? What's that process like? You know, I think that all of those are useful bits of information to have.
Yeah, also important to look at the termination clause of
Yes.
your
Yeah.
agency agreement. Make sure that they can't keep you forever. Make sure that they do not own your ideas forever.
Yeah.
There is a, I guess, orange flag in that some contracts do say that we can't control if another client comes up with a similar idea, which is true. They can't control it, but be very careful about things like that.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. And also, there are some termination clauses that will have specific, like lengths of time for which, like an agent controls like the royalties of a book, depending on, depending on what the arrangement is. It's just good to know what the expectation should be.
And also, just in terms of if you're bringing up things that you are afraid of, you could theoretically, I don't think it'd cause any harm to
Mhm.
think about what part of the process is the most scary to you. And if you
Yeah.
are comfortable, say, I am afraid of this part, and see what they
Hmm.
do with that. If they just say, oh, you're being unreasonable, don't worry about it. If you feel dismissed, red flag.
Yeah,
If they're able to
100%.
hold that feeling and make you feel better, green flag.
Yeah, I agree. And especially they're able to offer what they can do in that situation. You know what I mean? Because for me, if somebody were to tell me that something was scary for them, that to me indicates that people would need like offers of what kind of support can we provide and what kind of support can we not provide so that, authors know what they need to try and have around them during that time too. And I think having those expectations up front can be so useful because if you know that you're going to need, you know, I don't know, like extra support from your family and friends. Like that's good to know right off the bat.
Yeah. And of course, unfortunately, we don't have time to give every client a pep talk every day.
I
Um,
wish, but no.
yeah, we don't have the time or the energy for that. So it's not that we are, I mean, I guess a little bit. We're scanning for is this someone who can contain their own feelings about this to some degree? And just every so often, I have to give
Hmm.
them a pep talk. Totally fine, completely expected. I think it would be
Yeah.
unreasonable for an agent to be like, oh, well, that's just not my job, because that's every creative person. But I think we're also looking for, you're looking for an agent who will make you feel respected and supported, but also won't necessarily have time to do that every day.
Yeah. And honestly, if an agent claims that they're going to have time to support you all the time, no matter what, blah, 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 that to me is a huge red flag because that just means they're not using that energy appropriately within their job, right? We are to obviously like it's good to have a working relationship with people where we can encourage each other, but we're also not therapists. So there's a limit to what you can do. Usually, if I hit that limit with one of my clients, what I'll try to do is provide resources as opposed to saying, like, we can keep talking about this. I'll sort of be like, listen, like this is kind of like all I have to offer you, but like here are some other resources you can check out, or like maybe you want to talk to like other like your writing group or whatever, if an agent is talking as though they have no limits, that's also I think that's equally unhealthy as having too many limits. So it's good to know kind of whether your needs and their capacity are similar.
And Another thing that I just thought of, I think it's a huge red flag if an agent says, "I will sell this in a month," or
Oh,
"I will
horrible.
I will make sure that you sell 100,000 copies," or
Bad news
"I will get
bears.
you the best deal of anyone out there. I will get you an advance of this amount of money. I will get you
Yeah.
royalties of this amount. I will have you sold in 23 territories in the next year." These are all things people can't promise, but people do. And
Yeah.
especially when it's a competitive multiple agent situation, like we know that there are some authors out there who will take the person who promises the most and expects the least editorial work. So that's kind of the technique. If someone is just going for getting someone to say yes, they will make huge promises and they will say, "No, it's perfect. No need to do any work at all. And I'll get it out tomorrow."
Yeah. Not a great sign in my experience.
Oh, can you talk a little bit more about like time scale for this? Because I think a
Mhm.
lot of agents, or a lot of authors are worried that they're going to talk to one agent and feel like they have to say yes the next day.
Yeah, I mean, I get that a lot too, and I find that stressful as an agent and also like from the author's perspective. I think one of the hardest things that I struggle with as an agent is when someone comes to me and says, "I have 1 week to make a decision." And I know that like the root of that is that the author is actually feeling the pressure to make a decision, right? So if you get an offer from an agent and they say to you like, "I want to know by tomorrow," that's not a great sign. They're not giving
No.
you time to consider your options. They should really be saying to you, if they're giving you a time limit, it should be reasonable, is what I'm trying to say. Normally, what I say to people is that, if they need time to think, I just say, take however much time you need and get back to me. Because for me, I don't see myself as working on a super tight time scale with someone I'm interested in working with because we do these career contracts, right? So ideally, you're working with someone for years, not for like weeks. And so if someone takes a month to make a decision between a few options, like that to me is fine. Or maybe you're traveling, maybe you're sick, maybe you're a parent, like people have a lot going on, So to me, but it's nice when people say, you can expect to hear back from me in however much time. Like that's, I think, for me as an agent, like a super green flag for an author when they're like organized. And that doesn't even necessarily mean that I expect them to have an answer in that time frame. It's just nice to know like when I'll hear back from them. If
Is there a standard time? Is it like 2 weeks or 3 weeks?
So I hear 2 weeks from people, but then as an
Yeah.
agent, I find that really tight. Like if somebody came to me and said, I sent you a query last week, I would love to work with you, but I need you to make a decision in 2 weeks. Like in a normal work week, that might be fine. But if I have like a book coming out that week, or if, yeah, if I'm sick, if I, whatever, like 2 weeks is not that long. So I usually suggest to people 3 weeks. I think that's a more reasonable window. And I also appreciate it when people give flexibility. So, like, and I try to do this as much as possible with authors too, is to sort of say, I would love to be able to give an answer to this person in 3 weeks, but if you need extra time, let me know, or yeah, my hope is to have this done in 2 weeks, but if that's not possible for you, please communicate that to me. In that way, at least you have a reason, you know what I mean? If you have to go back to another agent and say, I would like a few more days to consider this, it should never be a problem to me. Unless it's like if you're asking for 6 months, you're ghosting people. Obviously, these are unprofessional things, but I think 3 weeks generally is what I recommend. And then if people do need extra time, being able to say that I think is also useful and helpful.
And it used to be 1 week.
I know, which is wild. I
Yeah,
don't
and
know
so
how
you'd
people,
you'd get the email, you'd throw everything off your desk, you'd cancel
yeah,
meetings, you'd print it out because back
yes,
when we did, sorry
yeah,
trees, and you would just read the heck out of it and be like,
yeah,
"Great,
it's
I will talk
wild.
to you Thursday." And
Yeah.
I think a lot of that was, I mean, on the one hand, that did kind of benefit the author because it was like, who's
Hmm.
dedicated enough to do that
Sure.
for me?
Yeah.
Then again, if someone was faking an offer and you threw everything off your
Yeah.
desk that week, I mean, obviously we couldn't send howler mails to them or anything, but it was cause to be
Yeah.
really, really mad.
Really
Um,
stressful, right? I mean, you
yeah.
do, and I have been in that situation where people have had competing offers. You kind of have to decide whether you're able to like make that commitment or not, right? Reading a whole book in a couple of days and like making a judgment call about it, that's a lot of mental energy in like a 72-hour period. I
Yeah.
can do it if I have to, but there are limited circumstances under which I'll say yes to that now because I have had bad experiences with it in the past. And yeah, I find that to be, if not a red flag, then like an orange flag.
how do you know if someone's faking an offer? I mean, because you both
Yeah,
brought that
you
up, so it
don't.
happens, right? So
Sometimes you can tell. Sometimes the timing
Yeah.
is weird. Sometimes you look at the project and you're like, really, you have 12 offers, which is
Mhm.
again just a guess. Sometimes they give a name of an agent who theoretically offered, and you're like, but they don't even work in that genre.
Yeah, I have had
I've
like
seen all
really
kinds
obvious
of weird
situations like
stuff.
that too. Yeah. And I've also had people who they're not necessarily faking it, but they're like stretching the truth. So they'll sort of say, "Oh, I have another agent interested, so I need a response in a week." And I'm sort of like, "Okay, do you have an offer? Do you have a call? What does that mean exactly?" And it's that kind of statement to me is just explicitly to put time pressure on you. That's how it feels anyway, being on the receiving end of that. Unless you have an actual reason to need me to respond that quickly. If you're saying like I have interest from other agents, can you get back to me in 2 or 3 weeks? That to me is much more reasonable. But like a shorter timeline than that, it is sort of a red flag to me because I'm like, I think you're just rushing everybody. If there's no concrete offer, if there's no concrete deadline, and you're just talking about interest, like that to me is sort of like, I'm like, I don't know what this means. And that level of uncertainty is like not a great way to start a relationship, right?
yeah. So I have
Yeah.
a follow up. This is a question we get all the time. And since we're talking about red light, green lights, tell me about the nudge process for you, what you think about it, and how often you can nudge before it's annoying.
Oh gosh, I hate it when people nudge me, but part of that is because on our website it says to give us a certain period of time. Honestly, we've changed it a couple of times recently, so I'm not 100% sure what it is right now, but it says we take X amount of months to consider a query. It's a long window. And so for me it's hard because if people are nudging me a lot within that time frame, I'm like, we've already sort of talked about this, like the first nudge, I'll just remind them because I'm like, people read a billion websites. Like, I don't expect people to remember the details of every single query. If they get back to me and it's been like 2 weeks, I'm like, guys, folks, I'm sorry, but we say months, not weeks. You got to give me some time. And most of the time people will be like, "Oh, sorry, I didn't realize whatever." But then if they keep nudging me, then that's a struggle. That said, if I've been in communication with someone during that time and they've nudged me a couple of times, I would say just, remember that from the author's perspective, like you're sitting and waiting, whereas I have like a list of a million things to do and you are on the list. I am not going to forget you. So I think it's balancing that kind of anxiety with, being like a clear communicator. But if somebody nudges me and says, can you give me a timeline? I find that more helpful than just like, why haven't I heard back from you? When will I hear back from you? What's going on over there? Oh, hey, just checking in. That's the quintessential, but if somebody asks for a timeline and can be respectful of that, then that's fine with me. Yeah. But I would say the
Yeah.
initial nudge is like the barometer for me. If people are really demanding versus being sort of inquisitive or understanding about the flexibility or the amount of time that's needed. But I do think one nudge is a reasonable thing in any situation, to be honest, because things do get lost in the internet sometimes, and it's important to know that you're not getting lost. So,
Yeah. Usually it's at 3-month increments, I think is reasonable. Is anyone going to hear back in 3 months on their manuscript? I guess some people will, but I think on average it's taking a little bit longer than 3 months right now.
yeah.
I thought of a reason an agent might want to hear back soon that is actually legitimate.
Mm,
What if they're considering two works in a similar genre and they know they can only send out one this season?
yeah, that's a good reason. Yeah. And I also have had situations where I've had like not multiple offers, but like I've expressed interest to multiple people. And I don't want to keep somebody else waiting for 6 months while I wait for an answer either. I try to be transparent about those kinds of things. Sometimes, like you'll have your like top priority, like I have absolutely fallen in love with this. And so you want to hear back from that person first. So saying to them, like, would it be okay if I check in 3 weeks? Do you think you'll have an answer for me within the month? That kind of question, I think, is usually how I try to frame it so that I'm not keeping other authors waiting 6 months to hear from me.
Or sometimes I just send I'm really liking this so far. I'll be in touch soon.
Oh, yeah.
You
Yeah,
know,
I do that
keep
too,
me updated.
for sure.
And in terms of checking in with agents, I think as long as you are friendly and nice and don't put pressure on them and Don't imply that they clearly don't have their priorities straight because they're reading other people's manuscripts instead of yours. I think you're usually okay.
Yeah, definitely politeness is the number one thing I would say when you're doing a check-in. Just be aware that like people have a lot going on in their lives, not just professionally, but I mean, I know a lot of agents who, as much as we try not to, we do a lot of query reading outside of our normal business days because there just isn't always enough time to sit and read a whole book while we're like quote unquote on the clock or whatever. And so being respectful of the fact that it takes a lot of passion to pursue new clients, and it's sometimes energy that like is really difficult to come up with.
Yeah, and if you just spent all weekend working after an entire week of working, to come to your inbox
Yeah.
and find someone be like, well, I just don't understand why you don't work harder, is very frustrating.
And it's very easy to send a pass in those circumstances,
Yep.
unfortunately. But if I do feel like that's going to be like the relationship I'm going to have with someone is going to be super demanding and not, yeah, that level of, when you said earlier that flexibility is important for, I think that's important on both sides. You know, you want to be able to get back to people in a reasonable amount of time, but you also, yeah, sometimes that's just not possible. So being understanding of each other's humanity is a good starting point, I think.
Yes, agree. Is it a red flag if an agent doesn't do blank?
I don't think so. I think it depends on expectations, you know, like is it a red flag on an individual level? Maybe. You know, if that's the one thing that you want from them, I wouldn't go with an agent who says they're just not going to do it. So I feel like editorial is one of the big things that comes up this way. Some editors or some agents rather are extremely hands-on in terms of editorial, and some have a much lighter touch or like a more hands-off approach that way. I think that, you know, if you talk to somebody and they're clearly not going to give you a level of feedback that you're looking for, that's probably a red flag for you. But I wouldn't say it's a red flag for the agent overall. It's just a process difference. If somebody said, I don't know, I don't know what would be a red flag. I feel like there are certain things like I will not email you. Like that would be a red flag for me, you know, but like in terms of more general process things, I think it's just finding expectations that meet your own needs.
Yeah. Is there anything that if they don't ask the author or don't bring it up is a red flag?
Hmm. Oh, that's such a good question. If they didn't ask about the author's goals, I think that would be a huge red flag for me. That's the number one thing I want to talk about with people on a call. I mean, sometimes it's a simple conversation, but I think it's probably the most important one. I mean, especially if you have a client who has, you know, like a certain publisher they want to work with, or like an editor, a dream editor they want to have, something like that. Like you were saying before, agents can't make promises, right? So being really clear on like, why do you want to go down this road? What is your end game? Do you want to be a professional author who's writing a book every year, or do you want to just publish this one novel and then, you know, after that we'll kind of like see? Those are very different approaches to how to work together. And I think that, you know, it can be really, really toxic if you end up with a person who has a super different approach that way. So, for example, if you do want to write a book every year, as soon as you get your first book deal, your agent should be asking you, okay, what's next? You know what I mean? Because it takes that long to get the second book ready if you want to be publishing pretty consistently. If they're not listening to those goals and you're following up with them and you're not getting responses, things like that, I think that can be like extremely frustrating. And that goes almost double for people who are writing things like picture books, for example. That's something that I really struggle with sometimes with my really prolific picture book authors, is those expectations of, okay, I want to be publishing all the time. And this industry is really, really tough. There are a lot of different approaches, but you can only submit so much, right? So trying to find, okay, well, what are the best choices to make to benefit you the most? And, you know, if you're churning out a book every week, what are we doing with those? Like, where are we going from there? So, yeah, I think that if somebody's not asking you about your goals and what your aims are, like that would be a huge red flag to me, because to me, then it means they have a goal in mind for you that they're going to try to achieve, and that's it, you know? So that would be a difficult one for me.
And also, just to point out, it's not that agents just don't feel like sending out a picture book a week.
No.
Even if they had the
Gosh, I
time
wish.
and
Yeah.
bandwidth and editorial and knew the answer right away and knew a bunch of editors, first you'd run out of editors because they'd be considering way longer.
Exactly.
And so you'd run out of editors. Even if you didn't run out of editors, you'd run into your options in your contracts. If you have them, I know some contracts don't have options, but
Yeah.
in general, they don't love it if you're publishing 52 books a year.
No, not at all. And honestly, like you would probably, at some point, like you're running into a question of audience too, right? Maybe you can, for picture books, maybe you can put out a book every 6 months, but at some point you're going to be harming your own career because your sales numbers are going to go down
Mhm.
unless you're, some huge best-selling author like with your debut that like just manages to ride that train. But that's so rare. It's so difficult to achieve that.
Well, even the pigeon books, there's not one every 6 months.
No, exactly. I always think of Sandra Boynton, who I think took a while to establish herself as like, I think she could release a book every day and children would absolutely, it would boggle their minds. You know what I mean? But there are very few authors that have a formula and an audience that's like waiting and willing for that to happen. And yeah, like how many authors out there are even remotely as successful as she is.
Mhm.
So yeah, I find that's usually the bar that I think of in my mind of like how many people could achieve that. It's a small threshold.
She's interesting though, because we were talking about her the other day, and when she was a
Hmm.
picture, she was a card maker, right? Like she
Yeah,
made like greeting cards. And so she was used
100%.
to this like fast turnaround. And she just had, what she did. She had a style, and I love her so much. That's terrific.
Same. But like to be able to have an audience that loyal, that's like that ready, and also like you almost have to be in a shorter format for that to work, right? I think there's like a difference between the casual reader and like most people in North America. Like I know people in my family who would call themselves readers who read like 4 books a year. And if it's taking somebody like 3 or 4 months to read a book, even if you put out a book every year, 25% of their free time reading is you. Like that's unlikely, so you do sort of have to like measure the expectations of an audience alongside everything else that you have to take into consideration, which is already a lot. So yeah, I think that having clear goals and being able to discuss them in a way that's like realistic and also that doesn't hurt your feelings. Like you shouldn't have an agent who's constantly just like, no, we're not doing this. If
Yeah.
they're saying no to you, they should have a reason and they should be able to explain to you like why they're taking a direction that's different than, what you might think initially would be the most beneficial.
And they should explain to you until you understand.
100%. Yeah.
And it's also just going back to this issue of time on the other side. I think it's reasonable for an author to say, do you expect me to respond within 24 hours or sooner?
Hmm.
Do you expect me to write a book every year or faster?
Yeah.
Just basic expectations of time, I think, are a really good thing to establish early on.
100%. And I love that you mentioned like how people deal with rejection too, because I do think that, it's not every book you're going to send out, no matter who you are, is going to get sold right away to the perfect editor. Beautiful relationship, wonderful. We all move on. Like I don't know a single author who that's been their experience over the course of their career. And I feel like knowing what happens when a book doesn't work. Okay, do you just move on to the next thing? Do you want to go back and revise and like try and resubmit that book? What is your preferred approach there? What do you expect from me? I think that's a really healthy, helpful conversation to have.
Yeah. And just ensuring that the agent will be there.
Yeah, 100%.
Not that you're likely to hate your editor, but what if you do?
Yeah, it does happen. And even if you love your editor, there might be things that you bump up against that, like even within the contract or within, like right now, I know that one of the challenging things I'm dealing with for one of my clients on behalf of them is that, they ended up with a conflicting obligation that nobody foresaw coming. It's super positive for them. It's going to be super positive for the publisher. But now, like there's some timeline stuff that like needs to be worked out. And like everybody is really happy, but everybody's really stressed. And so it ends up being a tense conversation because, everybody wants to make sure that they're getting what's best for the whole project, like for the client, for their career, for the book, for that, the path of the book in the lifetime of the book. So everybody gets along super well. It's a great relationship. I think it's going to be a super successful book. And also, there are these things to work through, right? It's not always super easy. So you want to make sure that there's going to be someone there to advocate for you and to listen to what it is that you need and what your priorities are.
And you could ask a hypothetical. What if I'm on tour and my books don't show up?
Yeah, totally.
If they're
That
like,
happened
too
to a friend
bad,
of mine the
publisher
other.
them.
Yep,
Yeah, it happens all
exactly.
the time. Yeah, but if you look
Yep.
for too bad, it's the publisher's problem, or I will make a call, or good luck with that.
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah, okay. So I guess just some general advice to wrap up.
Yeah.
Go slow. Don't let them rush you. Ask questions until you understand. See how they respond to all of your questions and how you feel about it. And what else are we missing? Some wrap up advice here.
I would say like the biggest thing for me is always like when Julie mentioned earlier that sometimes the authors feel like a huge amount of pressure. This is their one shot they've got an agent on the line. They're going to say whatever they need to do to make this happen. Avoid that feeling as much as you can. Avoid the scarcity mentality feeling, because there are lots of opportunities. And if your book is fantastic and you're getting an offer as it is, chances are good this will not be your only chance or your only offer or your only opportunity. There are always lots of paths. So I would say that have confidence in yourself and try to trust your gut as much as possible. If you get a bad feeling from something, even if that's just on a personal level, if you think it's going to continue to feel bad, you don't want that in your life. That's not going to help your writing. So I think that's what I would say is like the perennial thing for me. If it feels bad, don't keep doing it. It's not going to help you. It's not going to help the agent. Yeah, it's not going to help your book.
Yeah. And everyone's on their best behavior at first. Don't expect things will get better.
That's a really good point.
Well, this was all such great advice. I know our writers are going to really love this podcast in particular.
I'm glad. It's a scary world out there sometimes. It's really nerve-wracking. So I hope that, like having some different perspectives can help people navigate it and feel confident navigating it.
Yeah. But as long as you do the research, as long as it's an agent who's at an established agency and they're nice to you and they answer your questions and you understand what they're asking for and they explain and they're calm and they're not pressuring you, in general, within those parameters, it'll probably work out okay.
Yeah. And I think too, one thing that I've found over the course of like doing this for a little while is like so many things can get worked out if you just have a conversation about them, and that might not necessarily mean that you keep working together, you keep whatever, but I've had some really heartbreaking experiences where clients have decided they're just not going to work on a book anymore, or they're just not going to work with me anymore. And they've made that decision without ever kind of bringing an issue to me or talking to me. And that always makes me the saddest, because there's nothing worse than being in the position of being like, oh, like I would have done this differently if I had known, so learn from my sadness. Like if you do feel bad about something, bring it to the people you're working with and see if it can be worked out. Maybe it can't. And maybe that's like the closure that you need, but maybe after a conversation, things could be totally different and you could have a much better relationship. So I think there's always like a bit of, oh, I don't want to make people angry and like ruin this, or, oh, I don't want to leave a bad taste in people's mouth. But I think that trying to have those conversations is often more beneficial than not.
In general, an agent won't get mad at you unless you're mean or impatient
exactly.
or rude or, I don't know, critical. But if you avoid those, and if you're just coming from a place of vulnerability, I am scared about blank versus why haven't you done this for me sooner?
Yes, exactly. Or
It'll
even
go
if
a
you
little
do
better.
come with like, why haven't you done this for me sooner? Like maybe explain why, like oftentimes I feel like that feeling comes from a place of anxiety. So like, what is it that makes you feel like it needs to happen faster? And maybe focus on that. I feel like this should be happening more quickly because of this. So like, why isn't it? Or, like, I feel like it's a valid anxiety to bring to somebody who you're in a business relationship with. So as long as you can be sensitive to the fact that like, everybody has their own plate full of stuff, I think that pretty much any question you have is reasonable to ask as long as you do it in a way that's understanding.
And also, like, there's like 99% of the time, there's a really good reason it hasn't happened yet. And you're going to be fine. Maybe they're waiting for something to like line up so they can, so like, just a silly example, but say they were waiting for your award to come through before they pitched you to subagents, something like that.
Totally.
There's often a reason that like we're waiting for something to happen so that it benefits you. And waiting a week won't hurt you and it could help you. So yeah. We're often thinking about things and we forget to tell you our logic.
We're all out here doing our best for the most part.
Yeah, I think it's pretty rare that anyone isn't. So
yeah,
I agree.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's so
Thank
nice
you.
to talk to both of
Thank you, Emmy. It was so nice to talk with you. And I love
I'm
that
glad.
you think about things in such a lovely way. It's almost like your brain's category is literary fiction.
Gosh.
I agree. I found myself forgetting that I was hosting this. I was just listening. I was like, love.
Oh my goodness. You're too kind, honestly.
We are so glad that you joined us. And as always, we appreciate your feedback. Just head on over to the iTunes store and let us know what you think. It not only helps us make this podcast be the best it can be, but it also affects our ratings within the iTunes platform.
We'd love to hear from you. If you're feeling brave and want to submit your page for our First Pages podcast, you can send it to academy@manuscriptwishlist.com with First Pages podcast in the subject line. We'd also just love to hear from you.
And if you'd like to learn more about the Manuscript Academy and everything we have to offer, just jump on over to manuscriptacademy.com.